Hello everyone, today we talk about factional clashes in 13th, 14th century Florence. As you know, we already talked a lot about Italian communal factionalism under many points of view, because as you know there were different divides in this regard. It could be essentially international, social, or more, in fact, vertically political, like as the ones we will see today, that however were all intertwined. All they had to do essentially with the management of the commune, of the political, military direction of the community, and naturally they had to do with the tumultuous social changes that were occurring at this time. And the broader references are perhaps difficult to catch if you haven't followed the entire series about communal Italy, but I'll try to make it simpler. And today we talk specifically of Florence, by the way, that is not the only thing that existed, let's say, in the communal Italy in many ways. And in fact, I look forward to covering basically, and especially for the historical regions, series probably every, at least, the most meaningful Italian communes, right? But there are a couple of tens fundamentally, so it's not a few. But Florence, as you know, embodying a broader symbol, right? This culture, municipal feeling, and also effectively pre-modern statual reality that the city would have built and exported Europe-wide, and from which humanism, the Renaissance, etc., would have drawn most of its sap. And the connection with the previous times, especially as a channel about medieval history altogether, is crucial, right? It's often skipped. The world didn't become with humanism and the Renaissance, nor what was before actually is less impressive or important or relevant or impacting than what happened later. But unfortunately, the negative bias towards the Middle Ages, even positive one, unfortunately, very often doesn't take this dynamics in practically any consideration. Always, popularly speaking, naturally, lots of books have been written about this. If you're interested in medieval Florence, say late medieval Florence mostly, there's a beautiful book about it. In fact, by Najemi, who wrote about that and this period, the rise of Florence, etc. But what we talk about today is more strictly, let's say, it's of the earlier phase of Florentine historiography, right? Speaking of Villani Compagni, so these individuals who, for the first time, essentially in Western history, began to tell history itself in a quite different way, which is much more rational and to the point and objective, exactly because of the involvement that the same individuals had in politics and society, which is something rare for medieval standards in the first place, as you know. And these authors and their successors, let's say, are the best examples of how, in fact, the myth of the Middle Ages, written historically by just the clerks paid by some lord, is proven wrong, and proven wrong especially considering the size, right? This is not an exception, right? Here we're talking about a massive historiographical production that Italian communes simply began to expand exponentially especially from this time onwards. They had always had pretty good annals and chronicles, etc. But at this point, again, there is a leap forward towards the good aspect of modernity, towards properly what it means to objectivize. And this lasted a few times, in truth, because with the refeudalization of Europe in the, say, mid 14th century, 15th century, what we see as humanism and the Renaissance actually, from a historiographical point of view, tend to worsen their quality, because those who wrote were kind of ever more detached, in fact, by political, military life, etc. Instead, these people were just into it, quite directly, quite internationally, by the way, and therefore are inestimable source of information. And we will talk specifically, especially about Villani, that also for European history altogether is of dramatic importance. As you know, is one of the most famous sources of the early 100 Years' War. Compagni is more strictly, municipal in some ways, but, given that Florence was exactly at the center of that international dimension, of course, his work is also quite famous, in fact, and renowned. Pretty much, in medieval historiography for anyone who actually know what that is. And there would be a lot of premises to make, but as I was saying before, we will see how this factional clashes were, in fact, intertwining with the ones not just of Florence, but with the rest of Tuscany at this point. And we will see especially the origin of the white and black Guelph factionalism, which brought to a dramatic change in Italian politics and consequently also international politics, as we also discussed here and there. For example, talking about when we made that series about Dante, or talking about the Italian campaign of Henry VII, and also speaking about the Angevins recently, the Kingdom of Naples, the connections of this, especially Tuscan and Florentine intellectuals, but not all, right? There were bankers, there were artists, and more, right? Mercenaries, etc. That really were pretty much everywhere, right? From London's court to, in fact, Naples one, and making a lot of, especially money, but also ideas and techniques traveling and impacting, again, dramatically, especially warfare at this point. And incidentally, I'm researching about this right now, and I will keep probably in the future digging a bit into these relations, because I've always found them interesting in a European comparative perspective, especially Western Europe, as you know, I think has properly an axis that worked in a dramatically intense way since the high Middle Ages to pivot a great part of what we see as Western civilization. And this is the last phase of the great medieval civilization, again, before the crisis. And so we're extremely privileged to look into these affairs because, again, before that, we don't have too much evidence. Later, we have kind of more biased evidence. And so this is an incredibly precious perspective on dynamics, including the political ones of factionalism that we'll see today. So as I was saying before, I will not repeat myself about the broader political and social background of communal Italy at this time. There were essentially guilds ruling the system. They were still, at this point, not anymore quite monopolized by the milites, so by the knights with the capital K, in a sense. But at this point, we're evolving to something more comprehensive that the people was controlling, but still in an elite form, with essentially a parallel and staggeable and more advanced system that the one of the consular times, where the military class had exclusively ruled, albeit being also quite diverse from within it. They had judges, they had merchants, and so on. In any case, what we have stressed already in the videos, and it's a bit today's theme ongoing, is the feud, is the vendetta, is the broader violence properly that we were just talking about yesterday, for example, in the the way people formed even just their own military expertise, was basically a natural political dialectic. And the chronicles that tell these stories are still, quite creative, let's say, in explaining the origins of these divides, this conflicts that dated back, according to them, as we will see now, pretty, in fact, far back actually in time, and so in times that they also wouldn't know so precisely from a historiographical point of view. As I was saying before, authors like Villani and company are inaugurating a new form of historiography, whereas up to their time, Dante's time, historical memory was entrusted to essentially to the elderly, right? When somebody wanted to know something about their family in the past, where there were some single old people that also nobody really knows how really old they were, because there wasn't really quite a defined mechanism to determine when somebody was born precisely. The clan's say political importance was more important than the one of its members. And what is fascinating about this historiography is how they still, however, rationalize, make sense of the origins of these clashes that would have eventually flourished into something actually pretty big and international, from not even from the same Florence, but at least as we'll see, according to some, from minor centers, and eventually to Florence, and from there basically to the rest of Italy and of communal Italy, at least, but there with major international implications. And we're talking about specifically the divide between Guelphs and Ghibellines that I also made a pretty must-watch video some month ago. So this is strictly related to it, because what was there? The idea of that. It's not that we know with clarity or that we can oversimplify saying, well, but I've been told that those that were essentially, respectively the pro-papal and pro-emperor side. Well, doesn't mean much per se, right? How were they born? Because you see, the initial factions actually were the German ones, were in Germany. Why did in Italy this thing radicalize and also became the main, the main base, the main center of the same, not just Holy Roman Empire, but consequently, again, a European balance? This is a huge deal. And we simply don't know, because historiographically speaking, I mean, we know, of course, as we study it comprehensively and we understand how much was in it. But let's say if you had asked, again, as these authors that are answering you, right, according to them, right, so from the time being, not that they had to know the truth, but for how they saw it, right, and these were particularly unbiased sources for the times. Well, you get incredibly important answers. And so it's first about the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, and eventually the divide between the latter among whites and blacks, because the Guelph bloc, as you know, had triumphed after the Angevin conquest of Naples and so on. And again, we made lots of videos. I can't digress at every single step of the way. I will just make some broader reference. So the first moment of violent contraposition is located in spring 1215, so very far away from the time being. It's essentially 1 century later. Compagni writes in the early 14th century. Villani keeps writing up until his death in 1348 because of the Black Death. So they're pretty distant sources from the events. But these chroniclers, both Villani and Compagni in this case, tell how the gracious and beautiful knight, this Villani says, Buondelmonti de Buondelmonti, abandoned his fiancée of the Amidei lineage for the daughter of Valdrada Donati, right? The latter being, by the way, temporarily at the head of her clan. We don't know whether her husband was absent or dead, right? So this is just an anecdote in many ways. And according to Villani, this was a merely aesthetical question. That is to say, the young Amidei girl had to be ugly as a monkey, Davidson said. This Davidson is one of the German author who wrote a very famous history of Florence in the more than 100 years ago. while the Donati girl was remembered as a Jean-Claude Mervigueur, who's a current French-Italian historian, young beauty provided with sex appeal, right? But this is just chit-chat, right? Fundamentally, we don't know anything about this. This is just a story, an anecdote. It's the real story of, this great and beautiful knight, powerful one also, was, had essentially contracted a matrimonial alliance by being engaged with a girl of another clan, and he fell in love with this other beautiful girl of another clan, for which he left his fiancée, and so causing this terrible feud among the two clans. And the most concrete answer is that, feelings aside, that are always very important. It wouldn't be so strange, actually. It's all plausible. It's just that we don't know, right? It's also very plausible, and perhaps even more so, that the alliance between the Buondelmonti and the Donati could appear more advantageous, right, than the previous one with the Amidei. And anyhow, in the story, Buondelmonti breaks his engagement, and on Easter Day, 1215, just speaking of peace, he is assassinated by the Amidei clan that essentially set up an ambush at the Ponte Vecchio, and they simply get rid of the problem, at least the initial one, like this, in order to simply wash away with blood the affront made to their family, which was a huge deal because these engagements were also carried out with certain amount of oaths, of contracts and negotiations were quite important, remunerative. There was a lot at stake, and you couldn't simply say, okay, well, even assuming, imagine the girl was actually ugly, and the guy preferred another girl, and at the same time, the Donati were kind of maybe become, in the meanwhile, a better option. There had been some attrition before. Just imagine the honor of the family entire being properly stained. And so this was something that among what were factually mobsters, because this was, as all the Middle Ages, basically a community dominated by the most powerful clans. These were military clans, by the way, and they were pretty damn, in terms of lifestyle, kind of accustomed to that, right? So warfare, tournaments, bravados, brawls, this level of, just killing someone because they rejected one of your women was normal, was kind of obvious, right? So the feud between the two lineages begins thus, right? And it's destined in Villani's account to degenerate into a factional struggle, meaning that this thing would extend eventually to other clans as well, because it would engulf the whole freaking Florence. Now, according to Dino Compagni, instead, the feud opposed the Uberti family to the Donati and the Buondelmonti. So here you see a different version. The Uberti were a very powerful family, a Ghibelline clan, by the way. Think about the famous Farinata that, also had such an important role at the battle at the, as an exile in the Sienese army at the Battle of Montaperti, right? And as a Ghibelline supported also by German mercenaries of Manfred of Sicily, and annihilating the Florentine army, for which we have also, we were talking about it yesterday, the only document in the entire medieval history that accounts the composition of a medieval army that the Sienese seized while taking the Florentine camp, and that later on, during Renaissance times, the Florentines, by entering Siena, found in the archive, brought back for us to be luckily preserved. And he's the same one that saved Florence eventually as a Florentine, because the other Ghibellines in the rest of Tuscany wanted to wipe, literally to raze Florence to the ground. They would have done it, as we will see here. The Florentines would do the same, to Pistoia, and or however taking it out, almost annihilating it. And so these were incredibly and morally and also materially loaded individuals. These were true knights, were people, again, habituated to perennially fight. Dante makes of Farinata, for example, of the Uberti, the symbol of stoicism, almost to the point of paganism. Actually, Farinata was it's not that Dante arranges things, because you should have a background in order to read it. Since he was a Ghibelline, he was excommunicated, right? And Dante had essentially a Ghibelline link himself, and he estimated enormously Farinata, who was one of these baronial symbols, right, of power, of strength, of this essentially Germanic lineages, because these were all essentially deriving from also the Alighieri themselves, but the Uberti from Ubers. And this Farinata takes the name from the fact that he had blonde platinum hair, was the perfect knight in the imperial Ghibelline vision, and stoicism in a Roman Germanic sense was exalted in this individual. It goes to hell for that reason, but otherwise was a very good Christian. Just his bodies, the ones of his family, was scattered by the furious Guelphs when they retook the later on control. And so this is the scale of violence and kind of hatred. This is important to stress: hatred, right? Literally wanting to eliminate, to wipe out the physical trace of anything that these individuals had been. That's how the feuds, the clanic rivalries were loaded like. And the same Compagni, however, stressing that this was essentially a clash started from opposition between other families, actually, that involved all the rest, still quoting the Donati and the Buondelmonti, but inserting the Uberti in the thing, still places the origin of such major civilian discord in Florence, and outside of that, in that episode, in this moment back then, right? So something extremely old, again, that not even Compagni knew, better or worse than Villani in a way. And in fact, Compagni doesn't actually provide a date for the beginning of the feud that he places at the beginning of his chronicle, that actually begins much later in 1279. And Compagni's chronicle is much more compressed, because it's much more like a thematic history in a way. It does follow a chronological order, but it stresses different aspects. Very beautiful chronicle. Villani is, let's say, is colder, kind of more rational, more kind of, he also is very discursive, but he goes very much more in chronological order and with kind of a greater homogeneity of content. And simply his chronicle is much longer. It was, the most read work medieval times after the Bible and Dante's comment, just by telling you how important this source was and is still for medieval history. So more or less 1 century later, as we have seen, when the same Villani and Compagni lived, in Florence the Guelphs were in power, right? This had occurred, as we were saying before, due to essentially the Angevin hegemony on communal Italy after the clashes against Manfred, the conquest of Sicily by the French. Just made videos about this recently, as you know. And Florence had provided some of the largest help to the Angevins and would remain the single most important center of Guelph Italy, right? For many reasons. They were a city of bankers that had enormously benefited with the subcontracting of also Sicilian grain exports in the process and other resources, and also Neapolitan administration. They were just the largest city, right, and growing mainly because of that, because otherwise Florence wasn't like kind of more important than the other Tuscan cities before this time. As we were saying before, there were occasions in which it could have been curbed by another power, as she would do eventually with the other Tuscan city-states. But also it was just crucial in a political and strategical sense, because it was part of the Holy Roman Empire, was essentially the connection between Tuscany and the Po Valley, especially with Bologna, that, as we will see, also was white at some point, as Florence would be white wealth at some, but still wealth, right, in theory, and that's also part of on which the Papal States were trying to assert, and they would succeed its control. Speaking of Bologna specifically, it was a major market. It was a major demic center as well. So we don't need to digress, but just to give an idea of the size. And in Compagni's Villanis times, and this, they lived directly, and in fact, to provide us with crucial information. There were essentially, however, still clashes within the same Guelph party. And so the white Guelphs and the black Guelphs clashing for hegemony within the city, and pretty violently so. As you know, Dante is also a political protagonist in this, and if you especially check the first chapter of my series for his 700th death anniversary made last year, I provide with a lot of background about the situation, the political situation in Florence regarding this very topic. So if you're interested, you can search for that. I have a playlist, but if you search Dante Schwerpunkt, you should find it. So again, the chronicles attribute this split between the white and black Guelphs to a vendetta among the high-rank families that would be caused apparently by just a banal controversy. And this would be also not implausibly, for the aforementioned military lifestyle of the magnates, families' science, of an argument, a brawl among some youth after a drink, right? Or rather, two different disputes, each of one has at the origin a part of the story. The facts, in fact, are famously narrated by the Chronica of Dino Compagni, right? As you know, the white and black Guelphs were fundamentally a further split between the hegemonic Guelph party in essentially, respectively, a pro-imperial, factually Ghibelline sympathy and pro-papal Angevin French sympathy, in a sense. So this would be obvious given the scale of Guelph power. At that point, it would create divisions from the within, and people say, well, but the white Guelphs had a slightly different political ideology from the Ghibellines. Well, yes, in theory, but in practice, right? In practice, if you study the military operations, the political affiliations, the white Guelphs and Ghibellines are simply the same exact thing, right? And ideologically speaking, of course, it was in wishful thinking, right? A bit in the theoretical, ideal of what things should have been like. If you read Dante, the monarchy, all these things, of course, there are different kind of adjustments of different degrees of what also the Ghibellines were pro-papacy, right? That's the first thing they said every time they got excommunicated, because there is not an option. This is medieval Europe. Universalism is still the sap, the blood, the life of everything. There is an emperor and a pope, and that's the only possible reality, right? Which actually made an enormous lot of sense, civilizationally speaking, and we should, thank God, in fact, for having happened, because the entire religious military creed of Europe was embodied by that, and unfortunately, we have quite lost properly the meaning of these two authorities or taking sides in a kind of modernistic, progressistic sense, secularistic most of all, or anti-secularistic, depending on the side. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But in any case, studying these times is much more important. So, Compagni tells the story of this first, this episode would have first sparked the hostility between the whites and the blacks. So, In the first one, we witness the clash between the Cerchi and the Donati families. The Cerchi are rich bankers of obscure origins, because these are the people who really made a lot of money fast, but I mean very fast. And this is a bit typical of Tuscany, but Florence is a pinnacle of that because of all the subcontracts. These people had essentially, they were money lenders that had been subcontracted the anti-Hohenstaufen crusade by the papacy and the Count of Provence in exchange for those revenues later on. And so when the Angevins won, these people boomed economically speaking. And as you know, in communal Italy, nobility is not really a nobility of rank. People become that powerful, as we will see in the case of the Cherokee, because they are freaking rich, right? And therefore, not only they can afford to fight as warriors, but they want to become that. That is to say, these were kind of middle classes people that didn't have literally a military lifestyle, but as soon as they became powerful, they learned that, right? So because that was the point, right? It happened a bit, all over Europe. We made a video about the medieval French nobility just the other day that explains this for France, but in general, that the feudal elite in Europe kind of became a bit more refined in a patrician sense, whereas the city-states elites became more feudal in tastes. At this point, as you know, all these clans in communal Italy were soaked in French chivalric literature. They had this military lifestyle and so on. So they were literally still leaving that broader ethos. And the Cherokee were, again, this kind of people. They are considered as magnates in Florence, which means that they are the actual top, most powerful families that the government is also distrustful of, because they fear, as all the broader clans in this kind of egalitarian way that was still very elite in nature, that one of them could essentially Germanize city policy and become a lord of the city, like in many other Italian city-states would happen, and that Florence would kind of trying to avoid, even though there had been seigneurial, and there would be still seigneurial, experiences in the original sense. Then eventually, yes, as you know, later on, the Medici would take over, but that's kind of another type of lordship in the 15th century. Here we're talking properly of the fear of one single clan leader to take over the system. And as we'll see, both the Cerchi and the Donati were fitting that. And so it's not surprising to see that great part of the factionalism attached to the main division existing in Florence between white and black guelphs was connected to this, right? And the Cherokee as magnates have the magnate was deemed to be so, right? And their claims, their of even their lifestyle, right? They were pretty close in practice to their neighbors of high lineage, right? And the Donati hurt the Cherokee to the point of unleashing the feud. And Compagni himself in his Chronicle 120 describes the cause of this deep enmity. Quote, it happened that one family that were named Cerchi, that were men of lesser status but good merchants and very rich, and they dressed up well, right? Meaning they really they had visibly powerful, and they had a lot of servants and horses, and they had a beautiful appearance, which was meant in many ways, including the kind of the aesthetical racial one, because they cared about this aspect, how a person looked like. This is a reminiscence of the older kind of Romano-Germanic tribal idea that also the stronger was kind of superior in some way. And some of them, both the count's palace that was close to the Pazzi houses, and the ones of the Donati as well, who were the older of blood, but not so rich. From which, seeing the Cerchi rising in power and having also walled and enlarged the palace. Remember that here the Italian city-states were a living fortress. Like everything was fortified. There were house towers everywhere. The whole skyline was like skyscrapers. And they bombarded each other from tower to tower and all these things. And also displaying this great luxury, this great lifestyle, this very expensive lifestyle, began to have the Donati began to have against the Cherokee great hatred, right? So this is envy, right? The newcomers, the ones that had enriched more quickly, that are kind of more seen as more lowly for this reason by the older lineages that are powerful but not so rich at this point anymore because of this changes brings to envy, to hatred, to competition, and so on. Right? The Cherokee bought that palace and fortified it because they knew that just doing that and that close to the houses of these other powerful families would have caused would have displayed this, first of all, their enormous power, and so it would have been a first step to trying to oust them from their own position. So the head of the Donati clan, Corso, had married a Cerchi. Corso Donati is a very famous figure in Florentine history. He was known as the Baron, right? Because he really embodied, again, that kind of princely superiority. He's described it. They cared about always, again, to stress who had, for example, blue eyes and blonde hair, because that Frankish Germanic origin was still felt, right, even among these. Ideally, there were blonde-haired and blue-eyed Italians even before that, but let's say still the idea that there was some association, that it was from that older stock was something appreciated. Corso was kind of a hero of the situation. He's the one that both, in fact, in Compagno Villani's account, de facto saved the Florentine army at the Battle of Campaldino that started essentially Florentine the hegemony, in a sense, on Tuscany, crushing the Aretinians. Corso was at that time the podesta of Lucca. And so this tells you also how powerful they were. The podestas were those who ruled, essentially subcontracted the rule of the city for the communal government. They were mainly military men and chosen as such. And the Florentines during the battle, that was quite bloody and furious, didn't want immediately Corso to intervene, because that would have provided him a great fame in Florence that, again, those who feared the magnates would have never tolerated. And they told him, look, if you dare attack without our order, right, one of the Angevin Florentine command, because there was a Provençal count of the Anjou also next to the Florentine knights, you will be beheaded. And Corso allegedly said, in the heat of battle, when his reserve was meant, was there, it could attack, said, if we have to, if my army, if my fatherland has to lose, right, I prefer to die with them, right? And so if somebody has something to say against this, come to Lucca for the sentence, right? For my death sentence. And he charged, and the accounts actually do not say that he won the battle, but it's intended that his attack from the side, by the way, against the Ghibellines actually caused eventually the rout of the army. And it's a dramatic moment. It's a moment of glory, right? The same Compagno and Villani, for example, were kind of of lesser status. They were rich, but not so much like the Donati, etc. It's a bit like Dante with Farinata, right? You know, that these were even maybe political enemies in a sense, not quite, because they were, yeah, it depends. Villani was kind of a black wealth, Compagni wasn't quite, but in fact they estimated enormously, right? Even these single figures, because they saw the ancient traditional heroism in them, and they applauded, and they were proud that they were part of the same city and all this kind of thing. So these are deep feelings that they had. You realize even when you read the Chronicles. And Corso was about to become factually the Lord of Florence, right? I won't spoil it because today we don't talk about Corso Donati specifically, but he was killed too, right, during a clash among, in fact, he was about to take over the city with the support of foreign troops from other cities, and this coup failed. He was pursued by some horsemen and killed. He was essentially wounded at the throat, and he bled to death, but he was brought to a monastery, and he died there. But everybody was shocked by it, because these were the kind of men that could objectively take over, and we could have had instead of Florence as the symbol of Republican democratic ideas, we could have had the ruthless Donati tyranny that would have maybe made Florence much more of a military capable power than his kind of more popular government, like Milan, for example, where that was here. But the fact that it didn't happen has also to do, in fact, with the differences between Tuscany and Lombardy, and this kind of, in fact, strong, growth of the same clans that the Cherchi embody in this episode in many ways, and that would prevent that kind of more aristocratic, monarchic direction to take place. But it's not that these individuals didn't really want them for themselves. So as we've seen, Corso Donati had married Cerchi, but these matrimonial alliances did not seem, unbreakable grants of peace among the lineages themselves. In the last years of the 13th century, various accidents happen following one another, fueled by all this, kind of deeper and old antipathy that was eventually exacerbated by the rivalry for a very conspicuous dowry, and by the political, unpredictabilities of a very troubled era, right? You could, this is also kind of obvious. We were talking about it again just yesterday. There's no way to know how it's gonna end, right? The situation is so politically fragmented that everything can happen. You can't. It's just like today. You can't really predict what will happen politically. We have this kind of a framed mindset for which we kind of have an idea or can speculate. We really can't, right? The markets, the political, the strategical analysis do not work longer than 4 months, right? And even that with a high degree of uncertainty is still, by ruling out, in the sense statistically, some things that appear as unlikely, as it could be, I don't know, the pandemic or the war in Ukraine. And how could you predict that, right? There was factually no way. I mean, there was a way, but the factors that triggered that couldn't be controlled or foreseen, right? So there are lots of other threats like those ones that could still happen, but just because these ones happen, we try to determine to interpret them deterministically. No, right? That's a wrong way of seeing it, right? But you can still see, however, what leaves, right, the veins that run underneath reality. And so it was a bit like the conflictuality between the Cherchi and the Donati. In fact, the Cherchi were distancing themselves from the group of wealth magnates led by Corso Donati. and they were approaching the popolo. Now, this is a very interesting political picture because Corso Donati was a black wealth, so the most kind of inoxidable type of wealth that relied mostly on the papal Angevin alliance and wanted to keep things under control to essentially maintain the elite in charge. The Cherokee shift, right? Because initially the popolo, you would expect, that the wealth being traditionally more connected to the people, whereas the Ghibellines more with the empire, the feudal elite as such. But evidently it's not the case. And the popolo is growing in power. These are the years also of the, in fact, of the statutes of Giano della Bella, who was essentially a popular leader that reorganized the paramilitary, the people's paramilitary. The popolo, the people, was essentially all those who were not really the big guys, right? The magnates specifically, because some of them were actually very powerful, right? And they were borderline magnates themselves. The word magnates coming from the popolo at some point. But they were more relying on this kind of more egalitarian. Democratic is a bit too much, because it's not that the little people really counted too much, but it could be mobilized by these same extremely powerful aristocrats like the Cerchi themselves. So it's always the same story, right? It's the elite that mobilizes the masses and influences them and so on to make leverage on them. We would like to know the details of, calculating mathematically these forces. We really can't. The best way we can is kind of understanding this political subtleties in a way. So on December the 16th, 1296, a funeral degenerates in the beginning of a generalized clash. And the banal cause that tells you also the degree of paranoia that existed among these mobsters that were always to pass to the sword for the minimal thing, and they were always freaking out because they feared that from every time it could be an attack, an ambush, some sort of assassination, etc., is given by the fact that during this ceremony, while all the participants are sitting, someone of one of the two families, we don't even know which, stands up. By the way, this funeral was like in open air, like they settled like in a broader kind of arena type of sitting right now. And the men of the other clan, seeing this and fearing something like a sort of trick or a bravado of some sort, put their hands to the sword and they aggress the enemies. The Pazzi family that were close to the Cherokee one, in turn, opened the hostility against them after 2 years in 1298, and arrested by the Podestà of Florence. After this brawl, many young members of the Cherokee clan die after having consumed an ordinary meal in the prison, a dish that will reveal to be poisoned. And of this crime, Corso Donati is naturally suspected. This thing is also interesting because you see, medieval times prisons were kind of, up to that time, did not really exist. I mean, people who couldn't pay their debts have committed crimes. They were enslaved, they were confiscated, their goods were exiled, and things like this. For the first time in the Italian city-states, what you actually have, because nobody would see the point of maintaining a prisoner, which costed. In the first time, instead, with the development of statual administration and higher justice and law enforcement capacity that is happening in this context, brings, in fact, the first prisons to exist. And this aspect is interesting because you have public authority that is strengthening up, and also kind of for which these clans are struggling to monopolize control. and you still have an evident infiltration from the side of a powerful clan like probably the Donati one that poisoned the prison's meals to essentially kill his political rivals. So this tells you how public and private are still compenetrated, but it's also a great display still of, again, law enforcement in central authority capacity that was being formed, and especially in Florence, right, as a real state. After a while, a young friend of the Cherokee attempts to kill Corso Donati with a pike hit during a random meeting, right? And we are again on the verge of a street battle that wasn't a rare eventuality at all, right? A street battle that actually breaks out on May the 1st of 1300 when another accident, and so this is actually the second episode that Compagni talks about, puts in motion this mechanism of reprisals that in the previous cases had been blocked. Because you see the force of law that intervenes, somebody dies, but nobody really knows what's been. Everything is covered because they knew that being discovered or starting the feud would have essentially meant publicly, officially, to have broken peace, and it would have never ended. It would have been seen as an attempt to subvert the state. And you would have been exiled. The entire city would have been a battleground, and so it would have created an enormous amount of problems. The same people were the ones that were in control of business. They didn't want that to happen at all, but it would. And the violence and the humiliation suffered during a clash by a young Cherokee provoke the vendetta, transforming the enmity of the two lineages in a war, in which also the allies, the friendly families, let's say, are involved. And so the whole freaking city, including the people, some of the people at least, and this episode puts also on the fore another type of violence that is in fact the one of the youth bands, the brigate as they were called, from which brigade also in the modern language, that will develop later, but that has been underlined in the role of the political and parental clashes starting from this time onwards, right? Given that idea again that the young members of the clan had to prove through these bravados to be courageous and bold so that they could become knights eventually and being the leaders, etc. It was a form of, again, it's like the ancient comitatus, a form of thuggery, a form of initiation, a form of effective devotion for the cause that was more important. Right, the family, the clan is more important than individuals, and you have to be ready to die, and you have to be tested, right, and you have to risk your life, right, and these people would do it all the time because young people are hotheads, and again, all life was public here. Banquets were simply arranged in the streets of the quarters of the clans that were a bit like an enclave, but others could participate, arrive, and so insults started, and people passed the sword, and there were this kind of, of clashes also, literally during the same tournaments, there were many chances to kind of measure each other, and also in this sense testing what the military power, the military prowess, and also single individuals really was. It was a very important political thermometer. So let's follow Compagni's account about the second clash, and about the youth. So he says, since for the youth is easier to trick than the old people, the devil that increases the same came out from a brigade of youngsters that were riding on horseback. These were essentially knights together. Wu, finding together one evening of Calendimaggio, that was a famous festival in Florence, at dinner, mounted in such an arrogance that they thought they could fight against the Cherokee brigade, and to use, in fact, not just fists, but steel against them. And that on that evening, that is the renewal of spring, the Calendimaggio, women use a lot to participate to dances in the neighborhoods, and the youngsters of the Cerchi clashed with the Donati brigade, among which there was a I think this is like a nephew of Messer Corso. And here it makes a list also of the people, says, and Bardellino de Bardi and Piero Spini. So these were all other clans members that were associated to the Donati and that had this that were within their own brigade, and so they were attacked as well by the Cherokee, right? In fact, other comrades and followers that assaulted the Cherokee brigade with weapons. And in this assault, the nose of Ricoverino de Cerchi was cut by a man of the Donati Masnata that was said to be Piero Spini, and they took refuge in his house. This event constituted a blow, and it was the destruction of our city, because it grew so much hatred among the citizens. And the citizens are just the ones provided with political rights, right? Not like the mass of the salaried workers that come from the contado and live in the suburbs. Here we're talking about, again, those who have the duty and the privilege of participating to the army, which was essentially what the entire Italian communal identity substantiated itself in, the right of bearing arms, being traditionally freemen. The Cherokee didn't reveal, by the way, ever who this guy who was, who made this affront was, right, waiting to make great revenge, which is also very fascinating because it was a way of saying, we know who the one who cut the nose was. Here, Campagna even says his name. It was told because voices ran in the city, but the Cherokee who had suffered of that didn't reveal it, even though they were the ones who were hurt by this, because it was a way to know better. It was a creepily subtle psychological thing. First of all, like, we were going to take you out, we're not going to tell you, right? So we're going to make you cook in your own fear because of that. But also it was a way probably to deem the wall. It was a good excuse to accuse the entire enemy faction of that, right? Which they were technically responsible for, because they could have settled the thing by saying, who was this guy, we will punish him. It did happen at some point, but they would prefer themselves, like, to immediately, in that situation, to just stand by him and even saying good job in a sense, even though probably the elderly, maybe the same Corso were not happy. But again, courage was also estimated in a sense, in that kind of, again, always tension between instinct and reason, but still shows courage and intelligence respectively, and the two things cannot really exist without one another in war. Very Roman concept, by the way, from straight from Livy, in a way, but it was pretty universal, right? And Compagni goes on, so he identifies in this specific event the split of Florence for the second time historically, because it says again, so as it had happened in the 13th, like in the at the beginning of he doesn't give the date, but Villani says at the beginning of the 13th century, the city was split again, and vertically so, because he lists the magnates, the people of middle condition, let's say that the lesser people, and the religious people, the clergy could not defend themselves, but with soul that let's say at that point they were involved. This, I presume, it means that in supporting one side or the other, right? Trying to take side and say, at least trying to find the guilty, but in that sense kind of fueling further the feud, and maybe trying to recompose it also because of their own connection, because their religious institutions were connected with these people as well. And this is interesting. All the Ghibellines sided with the Cherokee because they hoped to have from them less offense. Remember, the Cherokee were wealth themselves, but the Ghibellines allied with them, right? And so these were kind of more white. And also with the Cherokee sided all those who were of the opinion of Giano della Bella, because they thought that they would have been hurt by his exile, given that, as we've seen, Corso Donati was opposed to him and his popular policy, and so this popular leader sided with the Cherokee as well. Was also from the Cherokee side Guido of Messer Cavalcanti. This was famous poet and friend of Dante, right? That because he was, it says, enemy of Messer Corso Donati, right? The Cavalcanti too were, an important family of French origin instead. Then it says, gives other names, says Naldo Gherardini, because he was an enemy of the Manieri that were married into the Donati, were relatives of Corso specifically. Then Messer Manetto Scali, that was actually the same Compagni's grandfather, and that was at the head of a banking company, and his consorts, because they were relatives of the Cherokee. That Compagni has a very moderate, he's kind of a white wealth in practice himself. Then Messer Lapo Saltarelli, that was the Cherokee's relative. Messer Berto Frescobaldi, because he had received from the Cherokee many money, right? He had been lent properly many money by the Cherokee. Messer Goccia Adimari, because he had a dispute with his own consorts, his own clan, so he sided with the Cherokee in that instant to separate himself from it. You see all the different reasons for which they would have been part of one faction or the other. Bernardo di Messer Manfredi Adimari, because he was essentially a comrade of theirs. Messer Biligiardo and the Baschiera and Baldo dalla Tosa, because they wanted to wrong Messer Rosso. It was a consort of them because they had been lowered in the honors by him. The Mozzi, the Cavalcanti, or at least the major side of the Cavalcanti specifies, so another part of the Cavalcanti was not at least siding with the Cherokee, and more other families and also of commoners sided with the Cherokee. So you understand, this is terrifying, because they would immediately take the chance to split right? Whatever the reasons were, this system was so complex, these clans were so large, so powerful, so intertwined, that they all had a reason for making their political move. And then Compagni talks about the Donati side, the black one. He said, and with the side of Messer Corso Donati held Messer Rosso, Messer Arrigo, and Messer Nepo, and Pinuccio dalla Tosa, for great, let's say, custom and friendship that they had. Messer Gerardo Ventraia, Messer Gerry Spini, and his consorts for the offense made, Messer Gerardo Sgrana and Messer Bindello. Messer means simply Meister, Mister, right? And so this was a title that they used. Probably these were all powerful. In fact, all the pictures I'm also uploading in the video are from this house towers in Florence. It more or less are all from these families, right? That remained clans of Florence for centuries, right? And so also in this case for habit, for custom and friendship. Then Messer Pazzino de' Pazzi and his consorts, the Rossi family, the greater part of the Bardi, the Bordoni, the Cerretani, Borgo Rinaldi, the Manzuolo, the Pecora the Butcher, and here it doesn't mean like the guy was cutting meat in front of, women shopping, right? We're talking about essentially who was at the head of the guild of the butchers, or at least controlled a very large business in that field. So people that actually were powerful. So there's many others. And then it adds also again that from the popular side against the Donati were the Cerchi, the Falconieri, the Ruffoli, the Orlandini, that of the Botte, the Angiolieri, is a famous also. These are all names again in the literature because these were knights and poets that are very famous. Cecco Angiolieri, for example. The Ammoniti, that of the Salvi of Chiaro Girolami, and many other fat people, which means many very rich people, right? Because the fat people were like the higher, like they were not necessarily magnates, it was just the rich part of the popolo, right? So from this division, this lengthy list, that just for the fact, imagine somebody writing a chronicle and being so precise about all these names, how important for them this division had been. As we'll see now, this will engulf the whole freaking Italy, right? The king of France had to send his brother, together with papal support, to quell eventually the white faction. That's how Dante was exiled. It was a total mess, right? The white exiles sided with the Ghibellines, fueled all the clashes in the rest of Italy. They eventually sided with the emperor. That's how big this thing was, right? It was a total mess. So all the city is basically involved in the conflict between the two families. And you see, you couldn't avoid to take side. This is also what the point that Dante makes at the entrance of hell, when he sees outside of hell, actually those who are called the ignavi, that is, those who were not, they had not taken in life political siding, and were so bad because they had not supported the right cause that they were not even worthy being in hell, because at least those who had gone to hell had decided to do something bad, and they had decided, but they were better than those who would have not taken side politically, because objectively remaining doing nothing meant to, in a sense, just to be subject of to passively suffer of the consequences, and not having the courage to expose yourself directly, and simply giving away your God-given right to act. And this is the point politically, as every time, and that's what we are doing instead. today, like saying, I don't really know about this thing, I have to read more about it, and then maybe there is a war going on, and maybe your country's involved, and everything is, I don't know, right, let's not talk about that, that you should deserve not to even be in hell, like you should deserve not even to exist, right, because that's how objectively weak and useless and irrelevant you are, and how much you let things happening just because you're too stupid and ignorant and worthless not to even realize that not doing something means that you still have a responsibility, and the worst one, right? So the analysis of these two sides provides also an excellent, as we've just said, list of the various reasons that rendered the essentially the expansion of the feuds possible. We're talking about affairs, business, honor problems, parental problems, personal enmity. But so everybody has a reason, as always, as von Clausewitz says, to make a war. But the antagonisms that tear the Florentines apart in this period had also some further motive. In fact, the Donati friends are to be found, as we were just noticing, prevalently in the Black Guelph Party. The Cherchi instead are to be found in the White Guelph Party, of which Compagni, as we've said, is also an influential member. And the latter have close ties with the Ghibellines, that in Florence are from quite a while essentially ostracized, right? They are in exile, and they are, as we have explained quite thoroughly in other videos, essentially entrenching in the countryside castles that the city doesn't quite control altogether, right? There are expeditions, there are wars, etc. But from the other city districts, this guerrilla is fueled, and it's quite a problem. Think about the Guidi Counts, a very powerful feudal lineage scattered all over the northeast of Florence, on the Apennines, and they are Ghibelline, and they support the enemies of Florence. They support Arezzo, for example, and other cities, and they side with the White Guelphs. They host them. They live there. They're part of these Florentine exiles are part of their retinues, the same one that raid the countryside, that try to storm other castles. They are maybe paid by the Bolognese White Guelphs, and that have contacts with the emperor, and etc., etc. So this is the kind of environment. And this closing, say, of the alliance between the Ghibellines and the people, as we were pointing out, is also relevant. Because this is not even just the people, but it's the radical wing of the people that is supported by the White Guelph magnates and the Ghibellines, right? And they are coalescing against Corso Donati, right? That has essentially brought to the exile of the charismatic leader of people, Giano della Bella, that has reorganized the popular the commoners, the popular paramilitary force in the city, right? So also to counter, because the importance of infantry was rising at this point, and the magnates relied mostly on their horses, but the city was not really the best best ground for cavalry, and so they also they have their own infantry, right? They bring even from the countryside, etc. But the citizens, the populace is becoming strong, and doesn't look favorably upon the baron that wants to take over the city as a lord, as a single lord. Now, but let's go back to Villani, actually, because he has another version of the origins of the white and black split. And it's still a matter of private vendetta, consumed, however, within a single lineage. That is not even a Florentine one, but it's the Cancellieri of Pistoia. Pistoia is a city in the northwest of Florence, it's a modest one at the time compared to the others, but it's still lively, right? And Tuscany is split in many different city-states at this point. They more or less they more or less counterbalance each other, and they're still independent, right? And in Pistoia there are these cancellieri, and within them, for reasons of envy and pride, as always, there is a clash, actually a brawl in a tavern among young men belonging to different branches of the same family. That causes the split, according to Villani, between whites and blacks, and from Pistoia this spreads, reaching Florence and other cities, because this thing of the white and black wealth basically engulfs the whole freaking wealth block, right? And it provides us with a beautiful example of how extended the factional feelings could be and how difficult it was to escape them, right? And just think about contemporary politics that, painfully enough, provides us with that idea, right? How much people are influenced about things that they hear, they think they hear, that happen in other places, even in other countries, confusing one group with the other, and kind of not practically making that sense of the situation. Here, the perception of these two Florentine chroniclers is very fascinating, because they have, after all, a different idea of what happened, and these ideas are sometimes, like Compagni's one is kind of more reliable in a sense. Villani makes of it a point because he tendentially wanted also to show how cool and great Florence was, and didn't want really maybe to blame specific individuals. It's a different perspective, and here we just descend into philological issues that are not even that necessary in this video. But let's say there is a reality, and then there are people's opinions. Even intelligent people's opinions can differ, as we know. But there is only one truth, and the truth is still, manifesting in an extremely complex and vast reality. So you can easily understand how, considering how interconnected, as we were just saying, this whole system was, as it was, how easy it is to spread such ideas, such opinions, such even just ways of life and visions of the world, because that's where it gets down to. Like, everybody does this like for personal interest, evidently, but they also back it with some say legitimization of sort, with some reason, some ultimate goal. It's not just, okay, let's seize the opportunity. At this time, actually, the latter thought it was quite necessary, because not seizing that opportunity very often meant to disappear. So we can't blame them to be also so warlike and conflictual. It's rather our perspective that deserves more attention, because we have even ceased to think that searching for a good reason is basically the only intelligent thing to live like. And so learning this episode is much more instructive than we may think, because it through analyzing such a complex reality of, after all, a pre-industrial reality of the 14th century, you actually can understand how much more complicated the world we live in is, and how much more alienated we are because of our specific individual fault of saying, okay, it's too complicated, I don't care to learn further. At the time, this logic were kind of clearer, right? And let's see, in fact, briefly, what consequences this fracture within Florence actually brought to. Because the blacks win. The whites actually come to power at some point, and this is the moment in which Dante becomes one of the priors, which means he ruled Florence in this collegial magistracy. He exiled the same friend Cavalcanti, was still, as we've seen, a white Guelph, for other internal disputes and reasons. So widow would die of malaria in exile. So Dante was quite bittered by this, but he thought greatly of his, secular duty and for broader spiritual reasons. And so everybody had this kind of ideas and beliefs and deep passions and faiths and hardcore and identities as well. So how do the blacks eventually take over? Because for a long time, what actually happened is that the whites prevailed, but the blacks had for a while to back down, and they weren't quite expelled. There wasn't like a major event in which in fact, Corso Donati always remained in Florence, right? He just kind of turned with the wind in many ways, as most of these powerful people would do, because as we were saying before, it was really nobody's interest to go at full war with anyone, right? It would literally make the city collapse. Also, here we're not talking about it, but thinking the pressure from the other ones, Florence would have suffered enormously. But it was an important adjustment that, in perspective, was heading towards kind of a more, let's say, black direction, because the role of Florence in the papal Angevin politics and strategy was not really negotiable. In fact, Boniface VIII supports the blacks because these were his bankers, and also the Angevin ones. Charles of Valois, brother of the King of France, Philip the Fair, Philip IV, so we were at the peak in practice of French power, having sent his brother as a mediator, right, with an army, by the way, or at least, with organizing one eventually with the papal support and more, commits himself basically to essentially render back Florence to the blacks in agreement with Corso Donati, right? And Charles of Valois, famously enough, marches on Florence. The whites and the Ghibellines, among which also, in this sense, Dante is, but also some of the exiles, some people had come back, are exiled or expelled from Florence on November the 8th, 1301, right? And that's in fact also the connection with the comedy when it starts, because it talks about this, and it's moment of the exile, it's moment of, imagine you have to abandon everything. Your houses, your goods, right? It's a terrifying experience, it's a traumatic experience. The violence, the distractions, the hatred. Dante was actually sentenced to death, and he managed to escape. So the whites are brought by the blacks to such, say, in detail, as brutal repression, and they would remain exiled for 10 years, which is an awful long time, especially in those periods. And the black government secures power in the city. Later on, Corso Donati will try to take over the city, but he will fail, will be killed, right? So Florence will actually remain governed by the priori for a long time. So it was kind of the association of the guilds, of the fat people, fundamentally. And this change has a important consequence in Tuscany altogether, because just imagine again the single most powerful city in which you rely on. At this point, Florence has crushed Arezzo, that is a Ghibelline power, is taken out. But the same Florence now becomes white, which means that it's siding towards the Ghibellines. It is kind of escaping the Angevin orbit, the papal orbit. No. The French army marches in, and the black rule is fundamentally secured, right? Florence will remain fundamentally autonomous, if not de facto independent, especially after, they will always rely on Angevin support against the other Ghibelline city-states that they crushed the Florentine army repeatedly, because they were, in fact, more kind of military biased, as very often as signories. Think about Pisa or Lucca, that were smaller than Florence, but managed to defeat their armies and the Angevin ones that had, backed them together, right, in open field. And still this system will be it's so big that it will be resilient, but effectively nobody can hegemonize it from the outer side. You can shift the balance, right? In this case, the black, the wealth party is not an option, really, especially considering that the emperor will march 10 years later. And the reason why, in fact, the whites were brought back actually was that the emperor was gone. And you would say, but those were, you said they were Ghibellines, right? So weren't they pro-imperial? Those were Florentines, and they would come back home, a home that would be besieged by the imperial army and managing to defeat it because they didn't want to be under anyone fundamentally. And this thing of coming back, of calling back the exiles for recompacting power is a big thing. Siena does it in that circumstance as well. Because it was about the unity and the attachment to the city that ultimately for them was the most important thing, right? That's why also for Dante was so traumatic to be exiled, among the other things. And Dante kept fighting among those, castles of the Apennine, supported by the Ghibellines, the Whites, and in the retinues of the various lords that opposed Florence. And we know a few about that, but we know he did it. Right, and Dante had already been, as you know, in Campaldino, in the first line, right, of the Feditori, the breakers that were also overrun by the Aretinians, and we risk to miss Dante in that issue. We don't know how he survived actually, but he allegedly said he was very scared on that occasion. Well, there is also a consequence for Pistoia. Because in this city, instead, the whites win. Pistoia has a similar history of vicious fights between the blacks and whites, but the whites had managed to secure power. So at this point, they were also negotiating with the Ghibelline powers that is, at this point, are also relatively weak. Before Henry VII of Luxembourg arrives in Italy and recompacts almost the entire Po Valley, at least the most important centers under Ghibelline rule, the Ghibellines here are struggling because they have the majority of the system against. And the resources of the most powerful rulers at the time, the entire Franco-Angevin and Papal alliance, right, while the empire still has to come back on its feet. So Pistoia actually has an heroic history because they decide to remain white in spite of all. In spite Florence just next door had been now secured as a major power under black rule. And in fact what happens that the Florentines and the Lucchese, because Lucca at this point was still wealth and black wealth, and just later, in fact after Henry VII marched in Tuscany, and actually the Lord of Pisa defeated after his death the Florentine army. Lucca is crushed at the Battle of Pontetetto and becomes Ghibelline as well, and will inflict later on some vicious losses to Florence at the Battle of Alto Pascio, for example. But what the Florentines and the Lucchese do, they ally themselves against Pistoia, which is a kind of like there is no match, right? Pistoia is doomed because it's smaller, and Lucca is a medium-sized center of the most relevant Italian communes. So it has also a prosper countryside. It's rich, right? It's on the sea. It's an important axis, also north-south for trade, etc. Florence is massive. Florence at this point has an enormous amount of military activity. Armies fighting like during the siege of Lucca itself on different fronts. during the same campaign, the same time. You understand, here is the seasonal warfare is over. Right? This is full-fledged professionalism kicking in. And with that enormous expanse, the just Milan that is credited to be the most powerful, but basically Florence has the same amount of activity military-wise, and it's terrifying, considering that it's essentially a popular government, whereas Milan is still like it's a signory de facto, even though it's still Guelph for a while before Henry VII, but it works very differently than in Tuscany. And it's also Germanizing other cities around. Well, Florence and Lucca besiege Pistoia that resists heroically. They are outnumbered, like something ridiculous. The Florentine Lucchese have tens of thousands of men. The Pistoiese have just a bunch of hundreds of knights, and they launch sorties from the city, even successful ones. That reveals, you see, the higher moral superiority of the traditional ways that are going to be crushed by the collective superiority of civilization, but that still have it, right? It's still inspire. In fact, the same Florentine chroniclers are impressed, and they record this because they say, look at these guys. Did these people really, they started eating, you don't know what, right? During the siege, they didn't have food. They resisted, and they, against any pressure, right? But finally, in 1306, after this terrible siege, Pistoia is captured by the Allies, and for some years, it's even deprived of its contado, which is split by the two Allies, because Pistoia's district borders East Florence and West Lucca. And so the Florentines and the Lucchese share the contado, which is a death sentence for the city in practice, because without contado you can't support the city, right? So for a while, the city is literally struggling for survival, for its historical existence, and it will remain because it was still a relevant center by some degree, but basically its power is annihilated, right? You don't hear anything anymore about Pistoia's military activity or anything, because it's being crushed by these bigger centers, and especially Florence, that is huge. So White's taken out of Pistoia as well. So if you look at what we have seen today with Florence specifically, which is favored by exceptional witnesses, right? A truly modern historiography that begins with Villani and compagni in Europe, shows how the hatred among lineages were, of course, mixed with the political conflict, right? And this favored, just like today, right? You have parties, sides, ideologies, but you have simply single people who hate each other's guts. And they do because they also have interests, of course, that are all one. So this is an important political acknowledgement in school. History basically teaches you this, so that the easy reason why most people haven't the palest idea of the meaning of any political thing concretely is because, of course, they're also completely ignorant about anything in history. This is not about listening to me and getting enlightened. If you don't have an habit to analyze these things, you're just done for. So I'm just saying, as I always say, don't flatter yourself, because it's much more difficult than it seems, especially for those who have never done it. So this division favored, in an era in which this hatred and political conflict, in fact, easily expressed through violence, the rooting of the factional logic as a new form of citizenry division. Why is this relevant? Well, because this left an important mark in Italian history, where municipalism, as you know, is quite strong even today in a way that other Europeans objectively do not quite understand. And it dates to these times. It's objectively silly, right? Because at this point, like, that's what also Italy's democratic deficit stems from, because they simply didn't have centuries of national history behind them, like, I don't know, the French or the British or whatever. This is valid for other countries in Europe as well, but meaning for a major Western country like Italy, you still find this essential divides that you don't quite understand even properly on a local base. But it's not much about this. Of course, Italians can simply joke about that, besides, still kind of having part of that. But it would leave an important mark at the time for the same political ideology that it nourished, because the communal institutions and also the political ones not just exist today, and they exist everywhere, right, in the world, and they're quite evident, and they're quite, in fact, narrow-minded, right? The average person in any part of the world, say in the West, we're habituated to properly having cognition of what happens. The rest of the world is just like, living lost in time and space. But the idea the mass ideas of people regarding politics are, if you ask a donkey, like, they understand things better, right? So this simplification of thought is traceable in a way. Italy at the time actually was very advanced, because the same modern political theory that eventually spread from the Italian Renaissance all over Europe, together with the same language of modern Europe, that it is the Florentine, the same Florentine that, in fact, Dante or Villani or company wrote like, and that became the third classical language, and the language of any branch, etc., in modern history, was still capable of creating a state out of this division, right? Other factionalism in other areas of Europe, especially the least developed, declinic ones, remain kind of the same, right? The capacity of reasoning on a higher level. Here, why the Italians managed to do that is that they were dramatically powerful. They were dramatically rich and driven. So they could afford to build a state, right? If you pick, I don't know, Ireland, or, I don't know, somewhere else where, clans remained up to somebody else didn't enforce another form of rule, of civilized rule, because let's be honest about this. This thing didn't belong to the culture, right? It didn't belong to properly the reality, the vision, the scale, the dynamic, the political interaction. Here you have individuals, again, like Dante, that play essentially an international policy. The Italian bankers here pay essentially the French military expense, the English military expense. It's much bigger than you see. But there is still one, because the world ages, as I always say, one specific negative aspect of this, that is, still there was a degeneration of the system into an autocratic one, right? It's exactly and paradoxically in these decades, in the early 14th century, that Italians secure in their communes a truly statile reality that was unknown in the rest of Europe. You can't compare the Italian city-states to any other city or state, because simply in the rest of Europe there is not a city-state, right? The Ansas weren't city-states. The other communes were not city-states. Just in Italy you have a state, and you have seen there how it's actually taking form, and that's why the struggles were so hard, because they wanted to control it. But at the same time, this factional struggle takes a much larger scale that, as we've seen, transcends the single city and brings to a generalized clash that has an enormous cost, and a destructive one. And what actually happens, which Florence paradoxically is not the best example of, because it would live on with this kind of Republican ethos opposed to the alleged tyranny is that, because we're still talking about the Middle Ages and autocratic rules at the time were not necessarily the worst that could happen, but let's say the other Italian city-states largely essentially degenerate into personal power. That is to say, in the seigneurial government, which in many cases is actually bringing order, but is more the consequence of a depletion of those same moral and material resources that before were more spread among the people in general, right? The citizens specifically. And that's why Florence is so important. It's so modern, we thought, because Tuscany and especially these major banking centers had a much more even spread of wealth that was earned, right? It's a bit like the West today, right? We boomed and we made a lot of money individually, but now there are new struggles, and wealth is spent. It's calories spent. Like money doesn't have a value within itself. It's you having to deal with reality. And so what we're witnessing is, of course, like a bit like in the Italian example in 14th century, is that yes, you can't be the top, most advanced, and probably you will reach some important results, but don't give for granted like something like individual liberty in the way you're habituated to if you cannot if the community itself deprives itself of that individual value, right? In other words, do not buy the bullshit that humans are equal, because first of all, they aren't, just without even needing any explanation of why they factually cannot be by any physical standard known to our knowledge of reality. But secondly, they have to earn their power. And what these people here believed, you see, even what I was saying before about the appreciation of the powerful guy, after all, is that this person had kind of made himself, right, or even belonging to a powerful clan, still had to maintain that power. Corso Donati, according to these authors that were not sympathetic towards tyrants, becomes the hero of the great battle of Campaldino, in which Florence had scored this major victory against Arezzo and had risen to great power, which is a mythological event for these people. And they appreciated that power. They appreciated that traditional. Again, this is living in the essentially in the Indo-European identity and beyond, right? The Romano-Germanic ideal of this stoic, strong, hardcore, never-changing power that is an Apollonian, Uranic, virile, authoritative, rational, orderly, disciplined force. That is the one that needs to rule the world, just like the empire that the emperor does, right? That's the meaning of it. It's a religious military principle in which all these people believed. So in the moment in which you stop thinking that, and you think that the source of, let's say, that the humans can't simply save the world because they're humans without doing anything and being ever less, productive and capable and, careful and prone to make an incredible amount of effort to go against essentially the degeneration of the world because of entropy. Well, you basically search for something that does not exist. You have to spur people to be better. You don't have to tell them, oh, it doesn't matter, it's not your fault, nothing happened, don't worry. How long can it go? Right? These were not times in which people really reasoned like that, even though these were some of the most civilized and kind of, updated modern terms of just said realities, but they were still pretty much imbued with that sense of, in fact, of the scene of honor, of prestige, of power, of glory, of responsibility, of strength, of beauty as a value. It's not random that Florence was the cradle of the Renaissance, right? Look at Italian art, born out of this mess, where people killed each other in the street and clashed between factions and municipal armies and so on. It's the most beautiful art. It's the most delicate. It's the most properly human in a beautiful ideal of humanity. right? And it's of course compenetrated with other arts, with the Gothic one. There is a lot that belongs also to other European cultures, but it really stems from this major push that the crisis conferred. It's just that the crisis also erodes resources. Not everybody can afford to fight, or they don't want to give up, right? They say it's too much, right? It's difficult, it's hard, but how worth is your liberty? Right? And you see the examples, like the example of Pistoia is incredible from a strictly military point of view. Like you see a resistance that never. Same goes also for those who resisted the same Florence later on. Right? Florence was a giant. Lucca itself at some point was not really anything, but they managed to defeat them in open field. The same Aretinians at Campaldino are shocked the Florentine chroniclers because they charge like with dramatic numerical inferiority, and they're almost able to break a much larger army because they're totally driven in a moral sense. They're hell of fighters, and this thing was recognized. Was a bit like the Romans documenting the Germans, saying these are kind of lesser than us. They don't have the empire, etc. But hell, that even if they are wild, they still got it. Right, so it's a bit like the history of civilization. Everything eventually blends in and decays, and we have already decayed from these times, and there is not much we can do to invert the trend, but it's still worth trying to stem this dynamic and trying to actually make the difference every single time, because in relative terms we still can do a lot, right? Even if we are doomed in the material dimension that we seemingly just concentrate on. And that is a mistake, because everything stems from the materiality of power, right? It's the spirit, it's the soul, it's moral forces, right? And there are no better examples than this. There's also a very beautiful passage of Villani that says it was about the defeat Florence suffered much later in 1341 against the Pisans at the siege of Lucca that the Florentines wanted to seize. And the Pisans intervened and they crushed the Florentine army. And Villani was an ambassador at that point. I don't remember in which Romagnol court for managing this broader situation, because it was essentially a Ghibelline victory against Florence, and Florence had to negotiate with the great northern Italian Ghibelline warlords who were supporting the Pisans as well, in some instances as well. And Villani was with a delegation of other ambassadors from Florence who were, terrified by the news of the defeat. It was clamorous, and they thought they would have been taken prisoners as hostages, etc. And in this gloomy mood, one of the ambassadors asked him, "Look, you that are keeping this account about, Florence," because they knew he was an historian, was writing this chronicle, said, "Well, tell me why we have really, how is it possible that we were defeated, right? Why did God make us lose? What's the sin that we committed?" Because if you look at the amount of money that of the alms that Florentines make for the poor, the amount of money, it's nothing like the one Pisa does. So why do the Pisans win and the Florentines lose? What explanation do you give it religiously? And Villani answers that it doesn't matter how much money were given by alms. This is beautiful as an idea, but it was the charity in the soul that was lacking towards one another. And this is referring to the same, in another way, even though in a kind of much more secure at that point, kind of statual reality, but still, in fact, about the lack really of care that the Florentines had towards one another, but like the ones we have today. Yes, we live in a better state, we're powerful, we're rich, we can absorb the hits. Yes, but how much do we are we really care about each other, how much will we actually give personally, right? Giving money, we have them. Giving them away, it's not a big deal sometimes. But what about the soul? What do we have within? Would we die for our neighbor? And Villani gave this answer. That gives you just the scale of this person, just from a literary and intellectual point of view. But more than that, this is and Villani was a merchant / banker, by the way. He traveled extensively. He had business everywhere. He was in Flanders, in England. He really had it, right? He knew that money, how important money were, and yet he says that the soul was more important, and that's not just a figure of speech. All right, I was glad to talk about this today. We'll keep talking about these topics because late 13th, early 14th century Florence is a bit an evergreen thanks to these authors as well, but in general for the scale of Florentine politics and warfare and society, etc. For today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.